Number 1. Jason Sweeney was 16, a kid from Philadelphia's Fishtown who split his days between school and helping his father on construction jobs. That spring, he started seeing 15-year-old Justina Morley. Around them, a small circle of teens orbited the same blocks and hangouts. Edward Batzig Jr., Jason's friend since elementary school, and two brothers, Nicholas and Domenic Koya. What looked like typical neighborhood closeness hid something colder: jealousies, posturing, and talk that turned darker as May drew to a close. On Friday, May 30th, 2003, Justina invited Jason to a wooded riverfront cut known locally as the Trails. Police would later say the lure was intimacy. The plan was an ambush. When Jason stepped beneath the trees, the other three emerged. What followed was a brief but deliberate attack, carried out with blunt instruments, ending with the teens taking cash Jason had earned from work. Investigators later emphasized that this was not a random explosion of rage, but a plan discussed in advance. Detectives moved quickly. Conflicting stories surfaced among friends. Items seized in searches and statements given in interviews tightened the focus on four teenagers: Edward Batzig Jr., Nicholas Koya, Domenic Koya, and Justina Morley. The outline was stark bait, surprise, overwhelm, and take the money, and it fit the physical evidence recovered from the scene and the teens' own words. Within days, all four were in custody. In court, prosecutors said jealousy and quick cash sat at the center of the motive, along with a chilling indifference afterward. Defense lawyers argued that Justina's role as the lure made her the instigator. The Commonwealth countered that everyone in the plan knew what was about to happen and chose to go forward. For the three boys, first-degree murder carried a mandatory sentence in Pennsylvania at the time: life in prison, with no parole. A Philadelphia jury convicted Edward Batzig Jr., Nicholas Koya, and Domenic Koya of first-degree murder and related charges. The judge imposed life terms, plus additional years for conspiracy, robbery, and possessing an instrument of crime. Justina Morley's path diverged. Her lawyers presented a portrait of a 15-year-old struggling with depression, prior suicide attempts, and substance use, and asked to keep her case in juvenile court. The judge ruled she would be tried as an adult. She pleaded guilty to third-degree murder and agreed to testify. Her sentence was set between 17.5 and 35 years. Years later, after serving more than 17 years, she was paroled. As juvenile sentencing law evolved nationwide, some aspects of the case returned to court. After the United States Supreme Court required individualized consideration for juveniles facing life terms, Nicholas Koya returned for resentencing. A Philadelphia judge reviewed his age, background, and role, and reimposed life without parole, finding no factor that warranted relief from the original penalty. Similar challenges by the others did not change the core result. The life terms remained. Psychologically, the case reads like a convergence of adolescent vulnerabilities, a craving for status, a performative hardness within a tiny peer stage, and the disinhibiting pull of drugs. Reporters and detectives noted that the plan structure, selecting a secluded place, assigning roles, and moving ahead despite off-ramps, suggested a desire to prove something to one another as much as to get money. It is a pattern seen in other teen group crimes. Once the script is set, no one chooses to tear it up. Public reaction was immediate and harsh. Philadelphia knows violence. But this story trust exploited. A best friend among the assailants, and a girlfriend used as the lure cut deeply. At sentencing, the victim's family addressed the courtroom, giving voice to the grief that would outlast every legal proceeding. Coverage emphasized the ages of everyone involved, and the sense that a handful of decisions, made over a handful of days, had destroyed multiple lives. Final factual status for the record: Edward Batzig Jr., Nicholas Koya, and Domenic Koya remain imprisoned on life sentence. Number 2. Michael Lee Bourgeois was 17 years old when police in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, said he turned on the two people who had adopted and raised him: Lucy Bourgeois Smith, an elementary school principal, and Terry Smith, a local company president. Classmates and neighbors knew the family from the Ephrata area, a place of tight routines and familiar faces. Behind closed doors, though, Michael had drifted toward older peers and a girlfriend group that included Landon May, with talk that moved from petty trouble to plans for easy money. That private slide would collide with the Smiths' orderly life in early September of 2001. In the months before the crime, prosecutors later said, Michael's world narrowed to friends who offered validation, escape, and a script for proving himself. He had been living for stretches with a woman named Drania Rodriguez, a connection that brought him into contact with older teens and young adults. According to later court filings, tension with his parents grew as they tried to pull him back towards school, home rules, and accountability. That push and pull between a family setting clear boundaries and a teenager chasing autonomy became the kindling for what followed. On Thursday, September 6th of 2001, Michael and Landon went to the Smiths' home. Investigators would later tell courts that the pair intended a burglary and, when confronted, restrained the couple. What unfolded was a prolonged, deliberate assault using multiple methods described by the district attorney and appellate courts as calculated and depraved. The focus here is not on gore, but on the pattern that prosecutors emphasized. The victims were overpowered in their own home and did not survive. Detectives built the case quickly. Physical evidence tied the scene to the suspects, and interviews mapped the roles. Michael as instigator alongside Landon, with earlier planning that also drew in acquaintances Stephen Estes and Drania Rodriguez as conspirators. Within weeks, charges followed. Michael pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, while Landon took his case to a capital jury. In late November of 2002, that jury convicted Landon and returned 2 death sentences. Findings later affirmed on direct appeal. Public reaction focused on the victim's standing in the community and the betrayal at the crime's core. The sentencing story did not end there. Because Michael was a juvenile when the murders occurred, his original mandatory life without parole terms were revisited after United States Supreme Court rulings required individualized consideration for youth. In early November of 2017, a Lancaster County judge resentenced him to an aggregate term of at least 80 years to life. A Pennsylvania Superior Court panel upheld that sentence in April of 2019, rejecting claims that it was an unlawful de facto life without parole term. The court pointed to the planning, the nature of the offenses, and the judge's consideration of mitigating youth factors. Courts and prosecutors described Michael's psychology at the time as a volatile mix of adolescent identity, seeking peer influence, and a drive to assert control through a carefully staged plan. In resentencing materials, the judge noted that the crimes reflected calculated decisions rather than a sudden loss of control. That framing youth weighed against planning and leadership ultimately defined how Pennsylvania courts treated his case. Closing fact: Michael Lee Bourgeois is serving a sentence of at least 80 years to life in state prison, making him parole. Number 3. Cathleen Boyer was a 16-year-old high school student from Scranton, Pennsylvania. Friends described her as social and impulsive, active online, and eager to defend her reputation. In the months before the crime, her life revolved around teen relationships and the digital echo of arguments that rarely stayed private. Another teenager, 18-year-old Kayla Van Wert, was a young mother. The two had once moved in the same circles. By late spring, their friendship had unraveled into a public dispute over the father of Kayla's infant daughter. And what began as posts and private messages hardened into threats and challenges. On a late Sunday night at the end of May, the tension left the screen. The teenagers agreed to meet in Scranton. Not to talk, but to fight. Witnesses later told police the meetup happened off McKenna Court, near an alley where neighbors could hear voices and see shapes in the dark. What many expected to be fists escalated in seconds. During a struggle, Cathleen produced a knife. Kayla was wounded and collapsed as people scattered. She was rushed to a nearby hospital and pronounced dead soon after. The online feud had become a fatal encounter, and a city woke to headlines about a senseless loss. Officers quickly focused on Cathleen. She was arrested as a juvenile, but charged as an adult because of the severity of the offense. Investigators traced the hours of angry messages that led to the confrontation, gathering statements from witnesses who described the rivalry, and the moment the knife appeared. Forensic work was straightforward. The unanswered questions were human ones. Why 2 teenagers let a dispute harden into violence? Why no one could stop it once it started? Defense attorneys would later suggest self-defense, pointing to the chaos of the fight. But prosecutors emphasized the planning, the agreed-upon meetup, and the fatal outcome. In early July the following year, Cathleen stood in Lackawanna County Court and entered a plea to third-degree murder. The courtroom exchange was brief and clear. By pleading guilty, she accepted responsibility for the stabbing that ended Kayla's life. The plea avoided a trial but did not end the grief felt by Kayla's family, who had already gathered at vigils and memorials to remember a daughter, a friend, and a young mother lost far too soon. 3 months later, in early October, a judge imposed a state prison sentence measured in decades rather than months. Cathleen, then 17, received a term of 7 to 20 years. In reporting after sentencing, authorities reiterated the timeline: a social media feud, an arranged fight in a Scranton alley, and a death that could not be undone. News accounts noted the defense's self-defense claim but recorded the final result in plain terms: the court's judgment and a long period of incarceration. What motivated a teenager to bring a knife to a fistfight? The picture that emerges is not of a mastermind, but of a volatile mix. Online taunts that felt inescapable, pride and jealousy around a complicated relationship, and the distorted certainty that a showdown would settle things. Experts often warn that adolescent decision-making is highly reactive, especially under peer pressure and public scrutiny. In this case, the psychological triggers were not subtle. A rivalry was amplified by social media. Threats were treated as a script, and the presence of a weapon turned a reckless plan into a fatal act. The court's record leaves no doubt about causation. Number 4. Ash Cooper, known earlier as Joshua Cooper, was a teenager from Bensalem, Pennsylvania, living in a trailer park community where neighbors saw a quiet kid who spent long hours online. Friends described shifting identities, private struggles, and the ordinary rhythms of school, streaming shows, and social media chats. The child who died was Morgan Connors, a 12-year-old who had been dropped off at Cooper's home that afternoon. What followed would be pieced together from messages, a video call, and the stark scene police documented inside a small bathroom. Investigators later said the day began with hanging out and watching television. At some point, Cooper said they opened a parent's gun safe, handling firearms and ammunition. The story Cooper told police shifted between accident and confusion, but the consistent thread was that a weapon in a domestic space met a moment of teen impulsivity. Neighbors recalled hearing a single crack that did not immediately register as a gunshot. Inside, the situation turned quickly from casual to catastrophic. What happened next separated this case from rumor and speculation. During a video chat on Instagram, Cooper flipped the camera and showed another teen the victim's legs, asking for help to clean up and move the body. That acquaintance showed the video to her mother, who called police. When officers arrived at the top of the Ridge trailer park, they found evidence of hurried attempts to tidy the area and a scene that left little doubt about the cause of death. The call, the video, and the condition of the room formed a straight line for detectives. Police quickly identified Cooper and took the teen into custody not far from the home. From the start, prosecutors treated the case with adult court seriousness, citing the use of a firearm and the digital admissions that followed. The early filings included criminal homicide, possession of an instrument of crime, and tampering with physical evidence. In statements to detectives, Cooper expressed remorse and described the shooting as an accident, a claim the prosecution did not credit in light of the total record. As the case moved toward resolution, a clear motive never emerged. Prosecutors said they could not explain why the teen handled a loaded weapon while a guest was steps away. The fragments that did surface pointed to isolation, volatility, and the distortion of judgment that can come with adolescence and instant online feedback loops. Experts were not called to build a formal profile, but the facts suggested a teenager struggling with identity and impulse in a house where access to a firearm turned a poor decision into a fatal one. In the courthouse in Doylestown the following spring, Cooper pleaded guilty to third-degree murder and related offenses. The judge accepted the plea, noting both the gravity of taking a young life and the chance, distant but real, for rehabilitation over time. The sentence was a state prison term of 15 to 40 years, followed by a lengthy probation tale. News accounts reported statements of sorrow from Morgan's family, who spoke about a child remembered for joy and kindness, and about a loss that no number of calendar pages could soften. Ash Cooper, number 5. Nolan Grove was a 13-year-old from Red Lion, Pennsylvania, a middle schooler who spent spring days roaming his neighborhood with friends. One of those friends was 12-year-old Kane Highland. On an April afternoon, the boys moved between houses, joking, roughhousing, and according to later testimony, passing around a handgun that Nolan had taken from his father's wall safe. What looked like ordinary teen bravado was quietly building toward a moment no one in town could take back. The picture that emerged in court showed a teenager intoxicated by the feeling of control a weapon can give. Witnesses said Nolan played with the gun's laser, pointed it at people during the day, and seemed energized by the attention. A judge would later say the firearm made him feel bigger, older, and in charge, a persona that grew through the afternoon as the three kids wandered the block. Those small choices, the showy gestures, the casual threats turned a game into a pattern. As evening settled on April 1st, 2023, the boys entered a narrow breezeway just off First Avenue, a short walk from Nolan's home. According to testimony, a cutting remark about Kane's mother sparked a sharp reply. In the next beat, Nolan lifted the handgun. A red dot flickered in the dark. A single shot followed. Kane fell where he stood. The surveillance clips and witness accounts that jurors later saw did not need narration. They carried the weight of what happened in seconds. What Nolan did next became part of the courtroom record. Instead of calling for help, he ran. Prosecutors said he changed his clothes, washed up, unloaded the weapon, and returned it to the safe. When police arrived, they were already tracking a day's worth of video, messages, and eyewitnesses who placed a gun in his hand again and again. The scene was small, a breezeway between two homes, but the evidence trail was wide. Detectives charged Nolan as an adult. The trial that followed in early June featured friends on the stand, including the third boy who walked with them, and clips that showed Nolan brandishing the weapon earlier that day. Nolan testified that the shooting was an accident and that he used the laser only to see in the dark. Jurors were asked to decide whether his actions showed the legal malice required for third-degree murder. After deliberations, they returned a guilty verdict. At sentencing in late August, the courtroom was full. Families sat on opposite sides of the aisle, and the judge spoke directly to the teenager before her. She described the videos as the personification of a bully, noting the moments when a laser sight hovered as a friend shielded himself on the floor. She recounted how Nolan took no immediate accountability after the shot and left his friend in the breezeway. Then she imposed a state prison term measured in years that will cover his late teens and much of his 20s. Psychologically, the record suggests a familiar and volatile mix: adolescent impulsivity, the rush of pure attention, and easy access to a firearm. Experts were not central to the case, but the facts themselves chart a path: an immature sense of power, escalating antics, and a final act that the law called malice. The jury's verdict reflected that reading of the day. Nolan Grove is serving a sentence of 15. Number 6. Alec Devon Kreider was 16 years old, a Manheim Township high school student from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and a classmate of Kevin Haynes. Friends and teachers saw a quiet teenager who earned decent grades, spent time with a small circle, and sometimes kept to himself. Kevin lived with his parents, Thomas and Lisa, in a suburban home a short walk from where Alec stayed with his mother. In the spring of 2007, the Haynes family welcomed Alec as a familiar face. That trust would be shattered before dawn on a May weekend. In the early hours, around 2 in the morning, Alec entered the Haynes home through an unlocked door he knew well. Prosecutors later said he first went to the parents' bedroom. From there, he moved down the hall toward Kevin's room. The family's college-age daughter awoke to the sounds of struggle and fled to a neighbor for help, a decision that spared her life. Police arrived to a scene that suggested haste and familiarity with the house, and the township that rarely locked its doors suddenly carried the weight of fear and unanswered questions. For weeks, the case consumed Lancaster. There was no obvious motive, no sign of theft, and no clear suspect. Alec returned to school and even attended the memorial. As detectives built a quiet record of shoe prints, timelines, and the unsettling possibility that the killer was not a stranger. The break came when Alec told his father he was responsible. 2 days later, his father went to the police. Officers arrested Alec that same week, and the story shifted from rumor to confession and evidence. A journal with dark entries, shoes that matched prints, and knowledge of a home he had visited many times. What could drive a teenager to destroy a family he knew? The clearest window was Alec's own writing. In entries read aloud in court and reported by the press, he described anger, depression, and thoughts about harming himself and others. He wrote that he had been wanting and needing to kill. And investigators later said those pages captured a mind spiraling toward a decision that no one around him foresaw. Even then, when the judge asked him at sentencing for an explanation, Alec answered, "There is none." In June of 2008, Alec pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder. The judge imposed 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Reporters noted that the surviving daughter described sleeplessness, panic, and the ache of planning funerals during college finals. The community's grief focused on the loss of Kevin, Thomas, and Lisa. The legal record focused on an intruder who knew the door, the rooms, and the people inside. For law enforcement, the case was closed by a confession and a mountain of corroboration. For the families, there was only the daily work of living with what could not be undone. Years later, Supreme Court rulings about juvenile life without parole sentences opened the possibility of resentencing for people who, like Alec, were minors at the time of their crimes. As those cases were being reviewed in Pennsylvania, the Department of Corrections reported that Alec died in a state prison near Camp Hill in January of 2017. He was 25 years old. His death ended any future court proceedings and left the same void he had created a decade earlier. A devastating human loss without a clear answer to why. Alec Devon Kreider pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder. Number 7. Gabriella Elizabeth Long was 17 years old. A high schooler living with her grandfather, Joseph Monka, in Edwardsville, Pennsylvania. Family members said he adored his granddaughter. Neighbors saw a quiet teen who had recently moved back and was trying to settle into routine. In the spring of 2019, that family trust became the center of a plan. Prosecutors later said Gabriella coordinated with 3 peers, Mercedes Hall, Christopher Cortez, and Devon Cunningham, setting the stage inside the home where she lived. According to investigators and court records, the motive was painfully ordinary. Money, a car, and the thrill of pulling off something that felt bigger than their lives. In interviews and sentencing remarks, relatives described years of trying to get Gabriella mental health help and a teenager struggling with instability and influence. Prosecutors, meanwhile, emphasized planning, roles, and the use of trust to gain access to a vulnerable family member. The emotional picture was complex, a granddaughter loved by the victim, but also a participant in a plot that turned a home into a crime scene. On an April night in 2019, Gabriella used a simple ruse. She called out for help, prompting her grandfather to respond inside his own house. When he did, 2 accomplices emerged and attacked, while Gabriella and another teen stayed in a nearby room, according to later testimony and plea summaries. Afterward, the group ransacked the residence, took roughly $30,000 from a safe, and drove away in his Kia Soul. They were seen later at the Wyoming Valley Mall, buying new clothes and tossing items into trash cans. Details police later traced back through surveillance and recovered evidence. The investigation moved quickly. Edwardsville police, conducting a welfare check, found Joseph Monka deceased. Within days, detectives linked the thefts, the car, and the movements of the teens. 3 of them, including Gabriella, were arrested, leaving a Plains Township motel where the victim's vehicle was located. And charges were filed that reflected both robbery and homicide. Over the following months, co-defendants began to enter pleas, and the narrative of planning and roles solidified in court documents and local reporting. By the fall of the next year, the legal outcomes were clear. Christopher Cortez pleaded guilty to 3rd-degree murder and conspiracy and received a decades-long sentence. Devon Cunningham later entered a guilty plea of his own. Mercedes Hall, also a juvenile at the time, admitted to third-degree murder. Those resolutions framed Gabriella's case when she came before a judge in Luzerne County. In August of 2020, Gabriella Long pleaded guilty to third-degree murder and criminal conspiracy. The judge accepted the agreement and imposed consecutive terms of 17.5 to 40 years on each count, amounting to a total state prison sentence of 35 to 80 years. In open court, her mother and grandmother spoke through tears about a teenager they had tried to help, and a grandfather who had loved her deeply, while the prosecution underscored the betrayal at the heart of the crime. Newsrooms across the region described the sentence as meaning she would spend decades in custody before any possibility of release. What explains her choices? The record points to overlapping drivers rather than a single cause: financial desperation, group dynamics, and a willingness to exploit family trust. Relatives referenced mental health concerns in their statements, but the court's focus remained on planning and participation. No expert psychological profile was presented at sentencing. Instead, the facts spoke to a teenager whose judgment bent toward a plan that spiraled into irreversible harm. Number 8. Claire Elaina Miller was 14 years old, a freshman from Manheim Township in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. At home, she lived with her parents and her older sister, Helen, who had significant disabilities. Classmates later described a quiet, artistic teen who spent time online. News coverage noted that an account believed to be hers drew attention on social media in the days after the crime, though platforms removed it as the case unfolded. Whatever the outward picture, investigators would later say that family stressors and a deteriorating inner world were converging long before the night everything changed. In late winter of 2021, Claire was struggling with mental health symptoms that clinicians would later diagnose as major depressive disorder with psychotic features. According to courtroom reporting, she had been treated for depression and an unspecified psychotic disorder. That clinical backdrop matters because the legal resolution ultimately acknowledged mental illness while still holding her criminally responsible. The portrait that emerges is of a teenager in crisis, withdrawing into delusions and dark thoughts that her family could not see clearly enough to interrupt. Just after midnight on Monday, February 22, 2021, a call came in from the Miller home. Police say Claire met officers outside and directed them to a bedroom, where Helen was found unresponsive. Their parents were asleep elsewhere in the house. First responders attempted life-saving measures, but they could not reverse what had happened. Claire was taken into custody that morning and charged with criminal homicide. The Lancaster County District Attorney's initial release documented the timeline: the emergency call, the scene at the family residence, and the swift decision to charge her as an adult based on the seriousness of the offense. Over the next 2 years, hearings focused on 2 questions: her mental state and the appropriate court system. A judge ultimately ruled that she would be tried as an adult. Reporters covering the proceedings noted expert testimony describing psychotic symptoms. At the same time, prosecutors emphasized the facts inside the home and the need to protect the community. The case remained in adult court, with the legal path narrowing toward a negotiated resolution. In March of 2023, Claire entered a plea of guilty but mentally ill to third-degree murder. The judge questioned her at length to ensure the plea was knowing and voluntary, reviewed the expert report incorporated into the record, and ruled that she was mentally ill but not legally insane. He then imposed a state prison sentence of 12.5 to 40 years. The district attorney's office stated that this outcome balanced accountability with treatment needs and that the correction system would be responsible for ongoing mental health care. Multiple outlets confirmed the term and noted that she would serve her sentence in a state facility. Why did this happen? The official record offers pieces rather than a single answer. Authorities referenced a mental health event on the night of the homicide. The court accepted that she suffered from a serious disorder, while finding that the illness did not excuse the crime. There was no broader conspiracy, no outside accomplice, just a family home, a sudden break from reality, and consequences that stretched far beyond one night. The community response mixed shock with sorrow. And in court, the judge spoke directly about the unique pain of a case in which the victim and the defendant were sisters. Claire Elaina Miller pleaded guilty but mentally ill to third-degree murder and is serving a sentence of 12.5 to 40 years in Pennsylvania State Prison. Number 9. Jacob Alexander Remaley was 14 years old. A quiet 8th grader from New Stanton in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. Friends and neighbors knew him as reserved, more likely to keep to himself than cause trouble. At home were his parents, David and Dana, and his younger brother, Caleb. In late autumn of 2016, that ordinary picture fractured inside a modest house on Thermo Village Road. Before dawn, while most of the neighborhood still slept. Investigators later said the pressure building in Jacob was not obvious from the outside. Defense experts would go on to describe a fractured inner world, alternate personalities with names and voices, including one he called Wrath, emerging alongside depression and instability. Prosecutors, however, focused on choices: access to a parent's firearm, the early morning timing, and the sequence of events inside the home. The contrast between a clinical narrative and a criminal record became the central tension of the case. According to an affidavit, Jacob waited until his father had left for work, then retrieved a handgun kept atop a refrigerator. What happened next unfolded room by room. A short time later, he called 911 and told responders that his father had shot his mother and brother. When police arrived, early impressions at the scene and Jacob's shifting account quickly raised doubts. In later interviews, he admitted using his father's gun and added that he would have shot his father as well if he had still been home. The initial misdirection, the timeline, and the weapon source formed the core of the prosecution's theory. From the beginning, the case proceeded in adult court. A judge ruled that the community could not be adequately protected within the juvenile system's limited time frame, and that treatment needs, while significant, did not outweigh the severity of the crimes. Over the next 2 years, psychological evaluations, expert testimony, and procedural hearings charted a path toward a negotiated plea that acknowledged mental illness without excusing the conduct. In late February of 2020, after his 18th birthday, Jacob stood in a Westmoreland County courtroom and entered a plea of guilty but mentally ill to 2 counts of first-degree murder. He apologized, saying, "I know I am guilty." The court accepted the plea, noting that the Department of Corrections would be responsible for mental health treatment while he served his term. The sentence imposed was 2 concurrent terms of 30 years to life, with credit for time already served. Reporters emphasized that the structure of the sentence would make him eligible for parole in his 40s, though there was no guarantee of release. The portrait of motive was complicated. Defense experts testified about dissociative symptoms and the growing dominance of the persona he called Wrath. Prosecutors countered that even within that framework, the planning showed legal intent and malice. The public record does not offer a single, clean answer to why. Instead, it documents a convergence of adolescent isolation, untreated or undertreated mental illness, ready access to a firearm, and a decision sequence that ended with a call for help built on a lie. The surviving family and the community, prosecutors said, were left to manage a loss that no legal outcome could repair. In subsequent hearings, Jacob sought to challenge aspects of his plea and the level of treatment he was receiving in prison, but a judge rejected the appeal and left the conviction and sentence intact. The court suggested renewed evaluation for appropriate mental health care within the corrections system, while reaffirming that the plea had been entered knowingly and without promises about placement. Jacob Alexander Remaley pleaded guilty but mentally ill to 2 counts of first-degree murder and is serving 2 concurrent sentences. Number 10. Harvey Miguel Robinson was a teenager in Allentown, Pennsylvania, a high schooler whose teachers remembered a volatile presence and whose home life was marked by turmoil. By the late summer of the early 1990s, he was living near the quiet city streets where his peers delivered newspapers and families settled in for the night. He was 17 when a string of attacks began that would make him one of the youngest people in the United States to face a death sentence for serial murder, and the first widely recognized serial killer from the Lehigh Valley. Court records show a progression across roughly a year. The first killing was the nurse's aide, Joan Berghardt, found after neighbors reported concerns in early August of 1992. Prosecutors established that Robinson was 17 at the time. The following June, the victim was 15-year-old Charlotte Schmoyer, a newspaper carrier. In mid-July, Jessica Jean Fortney, a grandmother, was killed inside her Allentown home. The pattern that jurors later heard about: night entries, victims attacked in private spaces, a community on edge was drawn from police work that linked scenes and timelines across the same city. A crucial witness survived: Denise Sam Callie. Her testimony placed Robinson inside another Allentown home between the second and third murders and helped jurors understand the method and escalation. Before the capital trial, Robinson admitted to related felonies, including burglaries and attempted criminal homicide tied to the assault on Sam Callie. In the fall of 1994, a Lehigh County jury convicted him of 3 counts of first-degree murder. At sentencing, the jury weighed aggravating and mitigating factors and returned 3 death verdicts. On direct appeal and later post-conviction review, Pennsylvania's High Court recounted the evidence, including the survivor's account, and upheld the death sentence for the Fortney case. Separate proceedings later changed the other 2 penalties as juvenile sentencing law evolved. Because Robinson was a minor at the time of the Burghardt killing, that case was resentenced under juvenile sentencing precedents. In state court and federal habeas filings, judges summarized the bottom line. The Burghardt count now carries a term of 35 years to life. The Schmoyer case is life without parole after Robinson agreed to waive further appeals. And the Fortney case still carries a death sentence that has survived multiple challenges. Recent federal opinions continue to address narrow issues about the capital sentencing instructions but leave the convictions intact. The question of why followed him through every hearing. Defense experts pointed to head trauma and long-standing behavioral problems. Prosecutors emphasized stalking, planning, and repeated attacks within a tight radius and time frame. The legal record notes an antisocial profile presented at trial and later disputes over how much weight to give possible brain injury. Even judges, years later, pressed for some insight. During the 2019 resentencing in the Burghardt case, the court urged Robinson to consider donating his brain to science as a way, however small, to contribute to understanding violent behavior. Public reaction in Allentown mixed fear, anger, and grief. The family spoke about interrupted lives, while the press followed every stage from the consolidated trial to the resentencings prompted by national shifts in juvenile law. The rare survival of a victim in a serial pattern lent investigators the testimony they needed to anchor a case without relying on spectacle. And the courts repeatedly circled back to 2 themes: a teenage offender whose violence escalated rapidly, and a community that demanded lasting protection. Harvey Miguel Robinson is incarcerated at the State Correctional Institution Phoenix. He is serving a term of 35 years to life for the Burghardt murder, a life without parole term for the Schmoyer murder, and a death sentence for the Fortney murder. Number 11. Jamie Lynn Silvonek was 14 years old, an 8th grader from Upper Macungie Township in Lehigh County, Pennsylvania. At home, she lived with her mother, Cheryl, and maintained a secretive, fast-moving relationship with Caleb Barnes, a 20-year-old Army specialist. Friends and relatives later described a widening rift at home as the adult world closed in on the teen romance. Prosecutors would say that Cheryl, worried by the age gap and the speed of the relationship, pressed her daughter to end it. In the weeks leading up to the crime, investigators documented a stream of messages that read less like adolescent venting and more like planning. The texts outlined a desire to remove the obstacle in their way, and prosecutors argued that Jamie urged her boyfriend to carry out a fatal attack so the pair could continue seeing each other. In court, the narrative of a teenager swept up in infatuation merged with evidence of intent, and the private pressure at home became the emotional trigger that prosecutors said pushed the plan forward. The night itself unfolded with almost ordinary steps. There was a concert, a late-night stop for food, and then a drive home to the family's neighborhood. What happened after they returned, authorities said, occurred inside the family vehicle and just outside the house. Cheryl never made it safely back inside. In later testimony, the Commonwealth emphasized that Jamie's messages, movements, and statements after the fact showed awareness and coordination rather than shock. Reporters covering the case noted that the state's theory centered on premeditation born from infatuation and defiance, not on a spontaneous argument. Detectives quickly focused on the couple. Jamie's statements evolved under questioning, and digital evidence filled in gaps that would otherwise have been guesswork. Within days, she was charged as an adult in Lehigh County with first-degree murder and related offenses, while Barnes faced a separate prosecution. From the beginning, the district attorney's office framed the case around planning, texted encouragement, and the sequence of events that led from a concert night to a family's worst outcome. Rather than go to trial, Jamie entered a plea in mid-February of 2016. Guilty to first-degree murder, conspiracy, and related charges. The judge imposed a state prison term of 35 years to life, with parole eligibility only after the minimum is served. News outlets reported that the plea acknowledged her age but kept the case in adult court, reflecting the seriousness of the planning described by investigators. Over the years that followed, Jamie sought post-conviction relief and a new trial, arguing her plea was not knowing and voluntary. A state appellate panel rejected those claims and left the conviction and sentence intact. Barnes took his case to a jury later that same year. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole, with additional time for related offenses. At that trial, Jamie testified under oath about the planning and about the messages urging the attack. Testimony the defense used to shift blame, but that jurors ultimately weighed against the broader record. The result left both defendants facing decades, or, in Barnes's case, the remainder of his life in Pennsylvania state custody. Psychologically, the public record points to a combustible mix more than a single motive: adolescent identity and secrecy, a controlling dynamic with an older partner, and the pressure of a parent trying to set boundaries. Advocates later emphasized her youth and development. Prosecutors emphasized choice, planning, and the danger of decisions made in the grip of obsession. The court's resolution reflected both realities, acknowledging age while imposing punishment measured in decades. Jamie Lynn Silvonek, number 12. Tristan Brian Stahley was 16 years old, a high school student from Skipack in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. Friends knew him as volatile and impulsive, a teenager who bounced between bravado and insecurity. His girlfriend was Julianne Siller, a 17-year-old Springford senior who was planning for graduation in college. On a late May weekend in 2013, the two argued at his family's home and then left together for nearby Palmer Park, a place they knew well. What followed would shatter two families and a community that woke up to headlines no one expected to see. The tension between them had been rising, typical teenage friction supercharged by jealousy, smashed phones, and threats. Witnesses told investigators the dispute carried from the house to the trail. Prosecutors later described a pattern of possessiveness and escalation, the kind of emotional storm that can swallow judgment. Reporting from the time noted that, along the path, the argument reignited, and the situation tipped from angry words to irreversible harm. In the aftermath, the body was dragged off the walking trail into thick woods, a detail that underscored panic and concealment rather than any plan for help. Back at the Stahley home that night, police were called for a domestic disturbance between Tristan and his father. During those chaotic minutes, Tristan admitted what had happened and led troopers to the park, where they found Julianne. From that point, the investigative steps moved quickly. A secure scene, taped-off paths, interviews with friends who had heard the couple argue, and the decision to charge Tristan as an adult. The charging documents sketched a tight timeline from the fight at the house to the confrontation on the trail and back again, leaving little room for confusion about who was responsible. In late September of the following year, Tristan chose a stipulated non-jury trial. The judge, reviewing the agreed record, found him guilty of first-degree murder. At a separate hearing, the court weighed whether a juvenile convicted of an intentional killing should receive a term of years or the state's harshest adult penalty. The judge focused on risk to the public, post-offense behavior, and what he called a callous attitude reflected in the record, and imposed life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Local outlets reported classmates filling benches at the courthouse and a community struggling to process the loss of a beloved classmate. Appeals followed. Tristan challenged aspects of counsel's performance and the legality of a no-parole sentence for someone who was 16 at the time of the crime. Pennsylvania's Superior Court ultimately left the conviction and sentence in place, and the state's High Court declined further review. The appellate filings memorialized key facts: the date in late May 2013, the ages of both teens, the argument that began at the house, and the discovery at the park. Those decisions kept the legal outcome unchanged while closing one of the few remaining avenues for relief. As to why, the public record points to a combustible mix: adolescent possessiveness, an inability to absorb rejection, and a quick slide from anger to action. A defense psychologist later described immaturity, attention deficit symptoms, and diminished capacity, while the prosecution emphasized purposeful conduct before and after the killing. The court, looking at all of it, concluded that whatever the developmental context, the danger to others was too great to warrant anything short of the maximum adult